Welcome to the third Integrated Activism slideshow. These are slideshows that cover the chapters in the book Integrated Activism that was released in the fall by North Atlantic Publishers out of California. The purpose of these slideshows is to give you an overview in a video-audio format of the content of the book. This chapter is about women's role in society, women's rights, and the bigger picture, the connections between ecological change that set in motion economic changes that then have powerful impacts on our social culture, but we are very much not inclined to look at social issues in terms of their ecological roots, even though those ecological roots are overwhelmingly powerful, particularly over time. We focus a bit, the name of the chapter is What the Heck is Going On in South Dakota. South Dakota has been a flashpoint for the abortion debate, and we think about the abortion debate as purely a social issue. Nobody talks about the ecological roots or even the economic roots of women's power, women's roles in society. But those roots are there and they are overwhelmingly powerful, and this is important for us to understand because, as I have mentioned before, that long-term ecological economic change is a long curve. These social issues are on a short curve, and the short curve has to follow the long curve over time. It can be no other way. And now that the long curve is changing, our civil society is going to change in response. So to really understand how women's roles evolve, there are striking parallels all over the world. I think looking at the issue cross-culturally, looking at the broader picture of patriarchy or male supremacy, whatever you want to call it. We know that the world is largely dominated by men, but that has not always been true. These days, men hold most of the wealth, most of the political power. That hasn't always been true. So the question of how did men become so dominant is an important question, and it's certainly not based on physical strength. Men have a minor advantage of upper body strength, but we don't have arm wrestling matches to elect senators. So that it's clearly a larger cultural pattern, and nor did it start in one place and spread all over the world. Male supremacy arose in many places all over the world repeatedly. So why did that happen? Let's see if we can figure that out, at least in a broader general sense, looking at the issue cross-culturally. So an anthropologist by the name of O'Kelly looked at this issue, and she came up with one very simple, very strong correlation, and that's that women's social and political power corresponds cross-culturally with their economic power. This page shows you a couple of gathering societies. That young woman on the left there is from the Kung San, which are a group that live in the Botswana area, Kalahari Desert. In many gathering societies, women provided most of the food and were highly empowered. So among the Kung, women actually provided 60, 70, 80% of the food, depending on the season or the luck of various hunters at various times. And they were highly empowered in that group traditionally, in that hunting gathering society. There was still some separation of roles, and men have always had a kind of political role of going out to meet with members of other bands, other groups, kind of being the political face of the society. But in small-scale societies, politics doesn't have the power or the meaning that it has in our society. It's a fairly minimal kind of role, whereas the roles of village leader, band leader, healer, shaman, those are very powerful roles compared to what we would call politician. So women arguably had equal power in a society societies that were not stratified, certainly in some of them. The picture on the right is the Mbuti. The Mbuti is one group of pygmies. Pygmy is a derogatory term, so one tries to not use that term, but it's the more largely recognized term for the groups of hunters that lived in the Ituri rainforest. And just as a kind of a footnote, the reason they're short, there's been a lot of several studies of hunters, traditional bow and arrow hunters in forested areas, and the shorter hunters actually are far more effective. They can move through the brush more easily, they can get closer to an animal without being detected, and that's the reason the Mbuti are so short, because being short in a rainforest is adaptive, if you want to use that term. I recently saw an article about claiming that the short people around the world are short because of nutritional deficiencies, and that the genetic shortness comes from living in a forest all your life. In any case, the Mbuti were similar to the Kong in that the women provided a lot of the food and were highly empowered, arguably equally so or close to it within the context of their own culture. Because they were economically empowered, they were also politically empowered, if you want to use that term. The exception proves the rule. The Inuit were traditionally hunter-gatherers, but the men did most of the hunting, provided most of the food, and were the primary decision makers. So among the Inuit, even though they were still a gathering level society, small dispersed bands similar to the Kung or the Mbuti, the men were much more in charge because the men did the hunting and the women did not, or not very much. So again, social roles tend to follow economic roles. In a more crowded world, the male roles of intermediary, politician, and warrior became more and more important. Human cultures all over the world turned to sexual reward as male leaders, big men, collected multiple wives. Of the human cultures studied by modern anthropology, a surprising 95% practice polygyny. So polygyny is where one man is married to multiple women. Polygamy, spelled G-A-M-Y on the end, is the term people are more familiar with, and that just simply means multiple marriage. Polyandry is the term for when a woman is married to multiple husbands. So 95% of the cultures in the world, men can marry multiple women. Polyandry is extremely rare. Monogamy is most of that remaining 5%. What happened, or what appears to have happened, and this is condensing a lot of history down into a few sentences, but specifically the development of social hierarchy paralleled very closely the development of male supremacy. So you see a Brazilian Amazonian chief or big man there on your left. As cultures become more crowded, they start to fight with each other. The male role of warrior starts to become more important. In village-level societies, it can become critically important because if you've got a bullying village next door and you don't have adequate defense or adequate male warriors, particularly when combat, as it was back then, was based on hand-to-hand combat, terrible things could happen. So the male warriors became very important. And one can imagine all sorts of rewards for what a male warrior or a big man gets for his extra effort in organizing the group. These big men is a term translated from many cultures around the world. These male warriors were also often spiritual leaders, and they were often men who rallied the group to intensify production. So they would get up in the morning and they would say, okay, folks, let's get to work. We got to work harder. We got to make more food. They would often have feasts of various sorts to celebrate how much food was produced or to show off their wealth to neighboring villages. So in a world that became more crowded, these male roles became more important. And in the beginning, it was not particularly oppressive towards women, but for whatever reason, the consistent pattern around the world has been to turn to sexual reward as a way to reward the big men. The early chiefs did not have a bigger house. They did not have fancier clothes. These are non-monetary societies, so they did not collect material wealth. In fact, they often had to work harder and were more stressed and had to do a lot to sort of maintain their role as big men. And certainly warriors, being a warrior has its negative side, as one need not elaborate. So the reward system seems to have been social status. They didn't get material things. They got social status and the right to collect multiple wives. Now, one could argue that there'd be a better way to do it, but in fact, this pattern has played out all over the world again and again and again. It's striking how similar it is, how parallel these patterns are. It's unmistakable once you dig into it, that human cultures all over the world, their response to stress is to turn to male leaders mostly, and those male leaders, their primary reward is social status and sexual access to more women and more wives. And, as I said, at the early stages of that process, it's not terribly oppressive to women necessarily. As the process becomes more developed, male supremacy becomes extremely oppressive and destructive towards women. And I found this picture kicking around when I was putting the slideshow together, the one on the right, Say No to Polygamy. Certainly in its modern, more developed stages, male supremacy is very detrimental to women's well-being. And there's a group of what I have to assume are Islamic women protesting polygamy. because it is so destructive to their well-being. The most extreme forms of male supremacy are found in areas under the most extreme ecological stress and military conflict. Purdah, the separation of men from women, can lead to extreme control over women's lives. The burqa is a manifestation of Purdah. Purdah is an ideology that women should remain separate from men at all times, or men who are strangers at least. Some men within the family are allowed to see women or be in the house with women, but under the strict ideology of Purdah, a woman is never in her life supposed to be in the company of another man or to be seen by another man unless one of her male relatives is present. So that's where the burqa comes from. The women can walk around, but they are not seen by other men. So this obviously is a imposition on women's lives. And I think one has to assume there's quite a bit of variation in the enforcement of these various ideologies, but certainly in its more extreme form, if a woman simply took off her shawl in public, that would be, she could be killed. Under the extreme interpretations of Purdah, women can be basically live completely at the mercy of men. They can, any error or deviation from the strict norms of how they are supposed to present themselves in public can lead to their execution or other forms of less extreme forms of degradation. And it's no coincidence that you find Purdah, you find these extreme forms of male supremacy in really ecologically stressed areas of the world. You do not find that kind of extreme male supremacy in areas that are fat and happy, that have reasonable population levels on fertile ground. You find it people living with high population levels on denuded ground is where you find these extreme forms of male supremacy, and they developed over the course of thousands of years of that male role of warrior becoming more and more and more important, so that the survival of the group comes to be completely dependent on these male warriors. I've got some quotes in the book, which I'm not going to put in the slideshow, about anthropologists who looked at that and looked at the trade-offs these village-level societies face in terms of supporting their male warriors and developing this culture, which is in some ways very onerous, but in other ways is a necessary means of survival under stressed circumstances. So the big picture of male supremacy connects ecological stress to increasing importance of male roles as warrior, as politician, as big man, as chief. And you can see these ecological economic connections very clearly in how women's roles have evolved in modern industrial society. So this is a picture of colonial reenactors dressed as women might have been dressed in the 1700s. People imagine when they look at the United States or think about the broader history of humanity that the past was some deep, dark age for women's rights, and the things have gotten better in the present. The reality is a lot more complicated than that. In fact, in the colonies, in what later became the United States, women, in some areas at least, had the right to vote, had the right to inherit property, had the right to sit on juries, had quite a few rights that they lost later on. Well, why would that be? Well, the early American colonial society was an agrarian society. Women were farmed, men took care of the children. So it was not a gender equal society, but it was less gender disparate than came later on. So after the Revolution, the American Revolution in the 1770s, the colonies won that revolution, as we well know. They rapidly began to industrialize. At first, the textile mill owners tried to hire whole families to work in the mills. That didn't work. So fairly quickly, at least in the cities, men became the breadwinners. They brought home the paycheck, and women had to stay home to take care of the children. So what you see in the early 1800s is a feminization. You see that the woman on the left, that picture, Steel Engraving Lady, I think is the name of that image. I don't know where that name came from exactly. I think, well, in any case, she's got a very narrow waist. She's seen as very frail. She faints easily. Women in the 1820s in the United States, it's interesting because it was a broad-based social movement. This was not just some onerous legislation that was passed down. There were preachers and writers and science. A lot of people got involved in this movement to sort of redefine women as being frail and intellectually inferior. And as a result, women lost the right to vote, lost the right to inherit property, were politically and socially, in terms of their power, marginalized as they were being economically marginalized. So as the Victorian era moved on, the dresses got even more ridiculous. And what's striking is to look at the late Victorian era. We're talking about the mid-late 1800s at this point, and the striking parallels between male supremacist societies around the world. The parallels include that women weakened men by stealing their vital bodily fluids. This is something that doctors were saying in the late 1800s in the United States. Women were seen as dirty when menstruating. That's something that you don't see in gender-equal societies, such as some of the early gathering societies or modern gathering societies that were still gathering. But in male supremacist society, women are seen as dirty if they're menstruating. Women were highly valued as pure virgins. Old widows and crones became devalued. So this commodification of women's sexuality, because it's being used as a reward for particular kinds of male behavior, this ideology of controlling women's sexuality, of valuing their sexual purity, is created. Prior to this, and this is worldwide, you see it in male supremacist societies all over the world, this focus on virginal purity. But before that, or in non-male supremacist societies, the word virgin doesn't even exist, or if it exists, it's not, there's no stigma to being a non-virgin. And in male supremacist societies, women's value is decreased if they are sexually active. They're seen as dirty, whereas increased sexual activity among men is seen as a sign of virility and manliness. So there becomes this tremendous double standard. And again, women were thought of as intellectually inferior and passive, not suited for physical conflict or warfare, or shall we say, law or medicine or any of the more well-paid professions. And it's also interesting to note that abortion was considered legal and normal and not a big deal throughout the 1800s up until the late 1800s, when the American Medical Association got together, and this is when antibiotics were first being invented. So the doctors were competing with homeopaths and herbal doctors and midwives and all sorts of other medical practitioners. And because the doctors had access to antibiotics, they started to gain in social status, but they needed a social movement, a way to sort of increase their public standing. So they took on the abortion issue. So in this period where women are stuck at home taking care of the kids, the AMA rises up its head. And by the way, doctors in this period were also doing clitorectomies, or what we would now call female genital mutilation, to cure women of masturbation. They were lying to women outright about as much as they knew about their reproductive cycle. They were telling women that they were least fertile in the middle of their menstrual cycle, which is the exact opposite of the truth, basically trying to encourage women, to trick women into having as many kids as possible. So there was a lot of medical manipulation going on at this time, and there was also political manipulation going on. So the AMA took on this cause of abortion, and finally abortion was finally made illegal by 1873. Following not long after that, women actually started to move into employment. By the turn of the 20th century, women were teaching, becoming secretaries, gender-segregated, less well-paid jobs. Reproductive rates were falling in spite of the manipulations of medicine and politics. Women were using birth control and various means of controlling their fertility, including illegal abortions. But they were entering the workforce in increasing numbers. Around the turn of the 20th century, you see these images come up. They're called Gibson girls. Gibson was an illustrator for magazines around that period. So the dresses are starting to shrink. You see them getting out and doing more stuff. It's not seen as disgraceful. I think these women look like they're sitting on the beach. But to get out and recreate a bit more. Women's roles, or the rise or fall of women's power, has not corresponded with politics, mainstream presidential politics in particular. You see various progressive conservative swings. So the early part of the 20th century, up until World War I, was perhaps the most progressive period of American politics. There was a tremendous progressive populist movement that rose up in that time. And around World War I, we see the suffrage movement has finally passed, so women get the right to vote, not coincidentally with expanding women's roles economically at that time. The 1920s, presidential politics, American politics shifted back towards a more conservative trend. But even so, women continued to expand their employment and continued to expand their social roles throughout the 1920s. This is a picture of a flapper from that period. So women were supposed to, up until this time, stay at home and be good, and now women are getting out, smoking, drinking, having more fun, and that's becoming more socially acceptable. Another reversal in the Great Depression, so a more progressive era comes in terms of American politics with FDR and the New Deal and all of that, but women at best are stalled in their development of political rights in the United States. The federal government in this time period developed a policy, an open policy, of hiring quote-unquote male breadwinners instead of women. So women were to some extent pushed back into the home, or certainly were not much in a position to expand their economic roles or their political roles. There was a conservative mood in Hollywood. Sexuality had become much more open in the 1920s. Even homosexuality was showing up in the very early films and on Broadway. In the 1930s, they reverted back to mindless Snow White kind of movies that didn't have much political content. We seem to be in a perpetual Snow White phase these days, but that's another story. In any case, sexuality became much more restrained in the media, and women were kind of pushed back into the home, at least for a while. Along comes World War II and transformed a lot of things. Rosie the Riveter is the image of women moving into the labor force in large numbers in World War II, which they did. But war is a very male thing generally, and women did not gain a lot of political rights during the war. But by the mid-1950s, the peak of women's employment that had been reached during World War II was surpassed. So a lot more women were getting jobs after World War II. So my argument is that economic and ecological changes do not automatically lead to political or ethical changes in society at large. Rather, they set the stage for which social movements succeed or fail at particular points in history. So this is a critical point. If you think that culture is culture and economics and ecology are entirely separate issues, then you're saying that the women who lost their rights in the 1820s were too poorly organized, too foolish, not smart enough to organize an effective movement to defend their rights. If my argument is that women wanted to be free as much in 1830 as they did in 1960. The difference is that in 1960 they had a paycheck. So if you've got a paycheck of your own and you come home and your husband is a dip, you say, screw you, I'm going to go do my own thing. Economic empowerment creates political empowerment. You remember, if you've watched the previous slideshow, that the historical cross-cultural definition of democracy is the process by which economically empowered people express that power in the political forum. We see that with the modern feminist movement, the modern civil rights movement, which we're not going to talk about at any length in this slideshow, but there's a parallel there too. As African Americans gained more economic power in the United States, their civil liberties movements were empowered politically. What's happened since the 1860s and 1870s is a little more complicated. The United States, up until that period, was kind of evolving as one big society, at least economically. Since then, we have broken down into at least two different Americas. One is an urban coastal America, which tends to be pretty solidly pro-choice. You could also call it pro-economic mobility for women. The coasts of the United States in these economically robust areas tend to be more prosperous. Economic growth has continued, not unabated, but for everyone. Women have gained, and the middle class has gained prosperity in northeastern cities in California. And these areas tend to be very pro-choice. A large part of the United States, a large geographical point, which is the Rust Belt, parts of the Midwest and South, tend to be pro-life. One could also call that pro-social contract for dependent women. Women in those areas have, the middle class has, and the working class, their wages have not increased really at all for decades. Women in many of those states, if you look at the states, compare men's and women's wages, the states stack up very clearly, and you can look at this more clearly in the book. But those areas that have pro-life politics are precisely those same states where women's wages are the lowest. And that's described South Dakota. When I did the first version of the book, which was 7 or 8 years ago now, at that point, women in South Dakota ranked dead last in women's wages. Now that's how you define, are you comparing the wages to men or as a fraction of, total working class wages? There's different ways to analyze the issue. But nonetheless, in South Dakota and a lot of Midwestern states, women's wages are depressed. They are often dependent on men. And it's interesting because I think there's a pretty strong class divide here. And speaking about it personally, I come from a working class culture, and I've come to understand very clearly that middle class people see things very differently than working class people in the balance between what I would call law and loyalty. Middle class people are very focused on law. They're very focused on social contracts. They see society as being organized by the laws and agreements of society at large. Whereas working class people often see the world through a more of a lens of social contracts. Who are my friends? Who is loyal to me? What's my family? Because for working class people, they don't necessarily have as many college degrees. The police aren't necessarily as supportive of their rights. Their survival is based much more on social contracts, on mutual assistance, on helping each other out. So for women in working class society, they are more likely to be dependent on a male breadwinner, and they are more likely to be much more dependent on their social network to keep them afloat. And in that context, of course, there are pro-life women in New York City and pro-choice women in South Dakota. It's not statistically uniform, but by averages, just in terms of what a person's interests are, women living in economically depressed areas are more likely to be pro-life and to see that as a defending of the social contract between men and women, that men should continue to economically support their families and not just run around and do whatever. So there's a pretty strong cultural divide there that has some legitimate roots. Of course, what happens in politics is people take these legitimate concerns that people have and manipulate them politically for their own ends, to try to get elected or try to sell products or just to try to whatever, for whatever ends the powerful politicians and pundits have. They manipulate all these social issues. The book, Integrated Activism, talks about some of the specific studies looking at different attitudes in different parts of the country and what that means. So we can see a strong economic correlation that has helped or hindered social movements at different periods in our own history. It's also worth noting that the pro-life movement has such an almost obsessive desire to protect newborn infants, and this in the same culture that it's not uncommon for right-to-lifers. Speaking as someone who grew up in a very conservative Southern culture, many right-to-lifers are also very militaristic in their foreign policy, very pro-military, very aggressive in terms of how they see the rest of the world. So we have the same culture that worships fetuses also being the very same culture that has by far the largest military and extensive nuclear arsenal that could bring the entire living world to an end at the push of a few buttons. So obviously this is a huge contradiction, but it's actually not that contradictory. Here, let's pull a quote out from Marvin Harris, Cannibals and Kings. "The growth of empire promoted the image of rulers as divine figures who protected the meek from overexploitation at the hands of other members of the ruling class. Imperial governments had to tread a fine line between too much and too little taxation. If the power of local officials to tax the peasantry was not restrained by the emperor, the people would become disorderly, and the cost of maintaining law and order would soar, and the survival of empire would be jeopardized. The natural outcome of the great provider image spread over the canvas of continental dimensions was that of the great dispenser of justice and mercy and divine protector of the meek. Here lies the origin of the old world's universalistic religions of love and mercy." So we tend to think of our own ethics as being this supreme pie-in-the-sky thing, high in the sky, this is just what I believe in an ethical sense, and to see it removed from the historical context. The reality is pretty striking when you look at it cross-culturally. All of the village-level pre-industrial societies lived much closer to life and death than we do. They all practiced very strict control over their own reproduction. Infanticide, we look at it as a horrible, horrible thing. It was quite common among pre-industrial cultures. And we look at that with great judgment, whereas we are the ones who developed hydrogen bombs, a picture of which we have on the screen there. So, we always tend to think of ourselves as morally superior. That's common for every culture in the world. But this worshiping of fetuses and infants, the worshiping of life in general, Harris's quote is interesting because you assume that the kings and great mighty chiefs have, as kings become kings, you assume that they operate at the expense of the peasantry, when in fact that's not true. Even if you look at European history, the peasants saw the king as their protector. And it was the local princes and barons who were trying to suck the blood out through excessive taxation. So in these imperialistic stratified societies, that's where we see this sort of obsessive devotion to protecting life. And you see it arising in the Roman Empire and empires before and since, that even as they were undertaking the most atrocious forms of warfare and public sacrifice, the Romans would sacrifice prisoners in public in front of a Colosseum, hack them to pieces with swords, even as they were putting forth this image of themselves as the divine protectors of life as being sacred. And of course the Catholic Church, the focus on fetuses and life being sacred, it's simply very conservative, very powerful forces wanting to gain control over women's reproductive capacity so they can use women as a sexual reward for male supremacist behavior, and so that they can control human reproduction. There's nothing more sacred than the control over human reproduction. And up until modern imperial societies, every human culture strived and struggled to maintain a balance between their own reproduction and the food system that supported them. Now that we are divided in classes, the upper class has tried to define life as sacred, tried to take control of women's sexuality, specifically so they can encourage the breeding of workers and soldiers. They want reproduction. So it's an extraordinary shift in human culture that has happened as we have become more stratified. And this obsessive focus on protecting life that is intimately coupled with an unprecedented destruction of life is an imperial development. It's all about empire. And for us to imagine that our ethics are separate from the historical context is just foolishness in the extreme. And it's going to bring an extraordinary ecological reckoning over time. Organizing around social issues while ignoring their economic and ecological roots is a short-term strategy. In the long term, nothing has a more powerful influence over women's rights than the ecological foundation of society. So as an organizer, I recognize the difficulty. If you're in South Dakota, you're trying to stop some heinous anti-abortion law, and you get up on the podium and start lecturing people about hunter-gatherers and the development of patriarchy, they're going to fall asleep and go away. It is very difficult as an organizer to get people motivated to do anything. So looking at, in particular in our age where that is so power centralized and these deeper issues have been expunged from the social sciences, and hardly anyone talks about the connections between ecology and politics, I recognize the difficulty as an organizer of making those connections. But we're moving into an age where energy supplies and the pollution impacts of our energy use are having increasing ecological and therefore economic impacts, and that's going to have a powerful impact on our entire civil society. It's going to have a very powerful impact on women's roles in society. I hate to be a doomsayer. Well, I guess I am a doomsayer compared to most people. I believe in cynicism of the mind, optimism of the will, which is simply to say I don't want my emotional uneasiness to separate me from the truths of history. And as I can see it, there's a very powerful political, ecological, economic root to women's roles in our society. Going forward, we're going to talk about it more in other slideshows, but embedding a long-term feminist movement that is ecologically rooted is the only thing that's going to work in the long run. If we simply try to focus on legislation, if we try to preach to people about the moral virtue of a gender-equal society, that will blow up in our face as the various ecological challenges we face become more manifest. So rather than taking off on a long explanation in this slideshow about how to address women's rights, the ecological foundation of women's rights going forward, how do we address that? We're going to do that in a different slideshow. So thank you very much for watching. We're going to continue to do slideshows for each chapter in the book. Thank you much. Have a good day.